Okay. Now, so you know, Zoom did something and they've created a mandatory waiting room now. So I have something else to look for in case people come on late, just FYI. And before Scott starts leading us in prayer, I know I sent out an email on Friday morning to ask you to pray for Cheryl, and I'd ask you to continue. I texted her this morning to see if she could get on. She hasn't texted me back. She's in University Hospital, you guys. She's had just a nightmare of a week. As you knew, she's has cancer. She's in remission, but's doing maintenance chemo now. Had maintenance chemo. They told her to get a a flu shot. She ended up having a very high fever. She finally went to the hospital on Thursday. Remember, she tested negative for COVID, positive for COVID. 3 weeks later, negative for COVID. The first two tests were short. The last one was a CDC test. She went into the hospital. They tested her positive for COVID again, which is not supposed to happen. Supposedly, it's never happened in Bexar County. I don't know if it's happened anywhere else. Anyhow, they wouldn't treat her anymore. They were going to transport her to Downtown Methodist, where her doctor doesn't have rights. So she checked herself out at midnight and drove home with 102 fever, was put into the hospital on Friday at University, and they tested her again for COVID, and it came back positive. So nobody knows what that means. The thought maybe is that that second test that came out positive was really negative and that she's just gotten it. But I don't know. Who knows? But has a 102 temperature that hasn't come down for a week. And they don't know if it's because of the chemo, because of the flu shot, or because of what. So anyhow, please keep her in her prayers. She's got a 18-year-old daughter who's basically home by herself, and she's scared. So
and just so all of you that might know, if you do have to be tested, those quick response tests that come back within hours are giving so many false positives and negatives. You might as well not take them almost. They're really bad. So she's been up and down. And when she finally did test positive, no one would talk to her anymore. No doctor would come in to see her. They just left her in a room and wouldn't really even answer questions. And she said, nobody even would know where I am. So she's been through it. And we know there are other people in the same shape. We'll say a prayer. God, we're always thankful. We're always mindful of your presence, the blessings that you pour out on us. But we have so many people who are struggling. God, Cheryl is in this situation. She's worried. She's frightened. Terry Baymonte's brother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer this week. Be with that family. They've been through so much. We're so happy to see Ron and Marge, but we ask for your hand on them. This has been a difficult journey. We're happy to see Sonny and Jackie with us as well. We know that your presence has been with them. We know that you hear our prayers. God, keep your hand on them. And our friend Teresa has been in the hospital. She's gotten a terrible shingle reaction that's been bad. Be with her and with us as we reach out, as we try and do the things that we know you want us to do. Be with us always as we study. Help us to find the wisdom that you have for us for our daily lives. Amen.
So, and we have Fran. I have a good friend here today. Fran is here in our at the house, and Fran and I worked together at Diamond Shamrock, Ultramar Diamond Shamrock in Valero for years, and so she's visiting in Rockport this week or weekend, so she's joined us. So we are on week 2 of David. And the purpose of studying David, one of the primary purposes is David is said to be a man after God's own heart, and having an understanding why David is a man after God's own heart. We started last week with David being anointed and being a young boy. And we left him after he had been called by Saul to play the instrument for him to settle him down. And so we're at the beginning of chapter 17, 1 Samuel chapter 17, a story that we, even if we didn't grow up in the church, have heard a million times, David and Goliath. But there's a lot more to that story than meets the eye.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I want to talk about. Mary mentioned this idea of David being a man after God's own heart, and it's never really spelled out. It never says because this, and we think it would be a shame to go through this study and not at least try and get some feeling. So we're gonna touch on that several times. The story of David and Goliath has become a sort of a catchphrase. People who don't read the Bible talk about a David and Goliath situation. One of the things I want to do, we tend to turn this into this like almost a child's story. And this idea of this giant, I think a lot of people begin to think, I don't know. Mary, can you bring up a picture? We're going to share a picture. These are two guys that, let's do down there. Yeah, that one. These are two guys who were in the NBA with each other at the same time. This is a modern day photograph. This is Yao Ming and a guy named Muggsy Bogues. It's not a doctored photograph. It's the real thing. And strangely, Muggsy Bogues is probably, about the height we might expect David to have been. I want you to picture a fight between these two. And by what we're taught, Yao Ming is not as big as Goliath was. This maybe will give you, let's show one other. If we can bring the others, another picture that I thought was kind of fun. This is the same guy, but he's with a golfer that any of you who golf would know. His name is Gary Player. And it's not a doctored photograph. It's not something taken out. These are just two guys standing on the golf course. Once again, if you want to picture David going out to fight this guy, it would have looked worse than that. But this is bad enough to give you some idea of what David was willing to go through. So keep that in mind. David and Goliath is sort of where we left us last week.
And do you want me to bring up one other, the map, just to make sure we know where we are? Okay, we left it when, let me see if I can easily get this.
Battle of the Valley of Elah.
Oh, right there. Okay. Oh, no, that's
no. Valley of Elah location.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. It's hard to share multiple things, but there we go.
Okay, and so I just want to make sure this is, remember, David had been going, well, and Scott will start this, but David had been going back and forth. He's a shepherd, but he's bringing supplies to his three older brothers as well as to some of the other people in the military. And the Israelites are on this side of the valley, and the Philistines, which are made up of 5 city-states, are on this side of the valley. The valley is considered a dry creek bed or slight water in the creek bed. And so
Mary, we're not seeing, I'm sorry, we're not seeing the map.
Oh,
okay. I'm going to stop sharing.
Did you see the photos?
You saw the photos, though.
Yes, we did.
That's
okay,
odd.
Thank you. Share, and maybe I have to do it this way, there, and then share. Let's see. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. So once again, the Israelites are on this side of the valley of Elah, and the Philistines are on this side. It was an important passage, and you need to remember the Israelites were defending the passage. The Philistines want to go through the passage, and the Israelites are defending it. Okay, so on to the story, Scott?
Sure. We decided 17 is long. We're not going to try and read the whole thing, right?
Right.
So the bottom line, the Philistines are coming. They've banded together. They're coming to invade. Saul's forces get wind of it, and they go meet them at this valley. There's sort of a natural passageway through there, and the two forces are encamped on either side. Nobody's really eager to get out of battle on the terrain. Nobody wants to give up the high ground. Remember, it's a valley, and so both have high ground if the other side charges. And this giant, this enormous Philistine, has been coming out daily and taunting them and saying, I'll tell you what, why don't you let's settle this with our champions. You send somebody out to fight me, and if that person wins, then we'll be your slaves. If someone can beat me, we'll be your slaves. And if I beat your champion, then you'll be our slaves. And nobody's really bound by this. Nobody's obligated to take him up on it, but it's demoralizing. Nobody wants to go out and fight this guy. And he begins to make it sort of a contest between their gods, the Philistine gods, and the Israelites' God Yahweh. And David has been sent. We get indication that he's gone back and forth. People have to support their family members who are in the army. And David comes with a sack of grain and some bread. But it says he brings 10 kind of pieces of cheese to give to the quartermaster for the army. So they're supporting the army individually. And David comes in and sees this going on. And it offends him. And here's one of the first clues we have about David, because David says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine to insult the army of the living God? That's the thing that annoys David. That's the point that he stands on. And it's something that Saul probably should have taken offense to, but it's a clue between the two people, one who's king and one's to be king. David just, the idea of them insulting Yahweh offends him. And his brothers hear him talking, and they say, what are you even doing here? Shut up. And I'm sure they're ashamed of the fact that they've been letting this go on, and they're all afraid to go out and meet this guy. And they tell him, stop it. And why aren't you at home watching the sheep? You've come down here to see a battle, and you want to get in on the excitement, and you're running your mouth. But word of David's comments. In fact, David asks him, what would the king do for the man who defeats this huge Philistine? And we get evidence that Saul has been telling people, hey, if one of you will go out and beat him, I'll give you all this stuff. I'll give you my daughter. You'll become the king's son-in-law, and your family will be exempt from taxation forever. And nobody's willing to take it up. But David's asking that, and it's obvious. He's saying, what do I get out of it if I go do this? Well, word gets back, and David calls him. Saul calls him and says, what are you thinking? And David says, you shouldn't let this guy insult Yahweh. You shouldn't allow it. Don't let any of your people be distressed on account of this Philistine. He says, hey, I'll go out and meet him. I'll go fight him. And Saul says, you're a boy. This he's a professional fighter. He's been fighting since before you were born. You can't do it. And David explains, he says, look, I've been a shepherd, and when a lion came and attacked my livestock, I killed the lion. And a bear came, and I killed the bear. And he said, this Philistine will be just like that. God will deliver him into my hands. I'm going to go fight him. So Saul says, okay, well, I guess you can. And Saul begins to dress David up. He puts his own tunic on David. He puts armor on David. He gives David a sword, and since there weren't many swords, there's a good chance it's even Saul's sword. And this is one of the things this
And
week.
remember, Saul is a head taller than the rest of the Israelites.
Saul is a head taller than anybody. Here's the thing that I want you to think about. I want you to understand. David was in danger, but I realized this week going over this story, David was never more in danger than at that moment. Because, first of all, on a purely physical sense, he's not prepared. He doesn't know how to fight in armor. He's not big enough to carry Saul's sword. But more than that, he is prepared to go out and fight on behalf of Yahweh. He's prepared to trust God to protect him. And at that moment, Saul dresses him up and he says, you're going to need armor. You're going to need a sword. If David goes out and fights under those terms, he's already lost. There's no way he can beat this Philistine under his own power. And yet he allows himself to be dressed up. And I can tell you from personal experience, we go through this at times. I have. And I find myself in places, I find myself, accepting things, and then suddenly saying, wait a minute, how did I get here? How did I get to this point where this seems natural to me, this seems normal? And David had enough sense to say, you know what, I'm not prepared to fight in this heavy armor, this bronze armor and with a sword, and he takes it all off. And there's one of the clues, if you want to know the difference between David and Saul. Saul wouldn't have walked out to fight without his sword and armor, and he can't imagine that anybody would. David says, God will deliver him to me, and he takes off the armor and the sword. Not many people. In fact, a lot of people in that army would have been so impressed with themselves. They would have been so flattered that Saul is dressing them up in his own tunic, his own armor. They would have gone straight out and Goliath would have killed them. David had enough sense to say, no, I'm taking it off. And so he picks up 5 smooth stones from this creek bed.
Which were probably about the size of a tennis ball.
Tennis ball or so. It's probably another thing I should mention, because this story turns into a cartoon for a lot of people. There have been numerous times through history that armies would have companies of slingers, people who use slings, and they throw these big rocks. If you have a picture of a slingshot, I don't know if you can see me, but everybody knows the rubber bands where you draw back. It's not that kind of slingshot. It's 2 leather thongs with a pouch in the middle. And if you've watched any movies they make about David and Goliath, he takes that thing and he swings it around in a circle. You can't use a sling that way. It doesn't work that way. For one thing, you'd never hit anything. For the idea of a sling, it works like an extension of your arm. So you picture a baseball pitcher, but he's got a 6-foot long arm, 6 or 7 feet long, this long thong. And so he throws, and I've thrown them. I mean, I have used them. I've seen it in action. You throw like you're throwing something, and the thong, the sling, is an extension of your arm, and you can wing a rock a long way. You can get a lot of force behind it. Professional golfers have this club that's an extension of their arm, and the club head is moving 120 miles an hour for the pros. This is very much the same thing. So he's able, and people who practice with a sling can get very, very accurate. So there's nothing childish about this story. It is very, very real. It's very, very historical. And David absolutely would be able to wing a rock the size of maybe a tennis ball, 100 miles an hour or more. It stands up to any test you want to put on this. If you don't, people who don't believe, historically, It works. It's just factual. So David picks up these 5 stones and he goes out, and he and Goliath have this exchange of words. Goliath is mad. Goliath is insulted because here's this boy and he's got a staff and he's got a sling. And Goliath says, "What am I, a dog that you send someone out with a stick to fight me?" He says, give me a real man to fight. And he says, he turns to the boy and he is hot and he says, "I'm going to cut you into pieces and the birds are going to feast on your body." And David turns right around. He says, "No, God's going to deliver me into your hands. The birds are going to feast on your entire army. This day, God is going to deliver your entire army." And it enrages Goliath, and David rushes toward him. And I would venture to say that David is probably, quite possibly, the only person in this army who would rush toward Goliath. Everyone else was afraid of him, and he rushes towards him. He fires this sling. He slings this rock, catches him right in the forehead. And the other thing, if you remember from last week, you've got a picture, this giant guy, like the picture we just showed, but bigger, is also covered up in armor. He's got greaves, which are these armor plates that protect your legs. And he's got a shield bearer with him. So even if you were going to fight him with a sword, he is more than imposing, virtually impossible. David runs out, slings this enormous rock, catches him in the forehead. It says it embeds itself, and the giant falls face down. It's remarkable to say the least, but it's a sign of who David is. When you talk about him being a man after God's own heart, David is not willing to accept what's going on here, and he's the only one willing to ride out. You want to talk about it?
Well, then after that, David approaches him, kills him with Goliath's own sword, takes Goliath's sword away from him, finishes the act, and then chops off his head.
Cuts his head off with Goliath's own sword. And when the Philistines see this champion, this giant, defeated, they think this guy is, it's like having a tank. You can't beat us. Nobody can attack this. When they see the biggest, baddest guy they have go down, in a heap, go down face first and get his head cut off, they scatter. And
then I was going to say, so remember, chapters, as Scott often tells us, were put in afterwards. So 17 comes to a conclusion here pretty quickly, and then it goes into 18. So 17 and 18 are an extension of each other. But so at that point, the Israelites, at the end of 17, or at the end of the story of David and Goliath, the Israelites chase after the Philistines, and they're a running away army.
An army that is fleeing, an army that is in wild retreat, is in trouble. Again, historically, when an army turns and runs and scatters, they get run down from behind, and it's a slaughter. It's a terrible thing. And the people, the men of Israel who have been sitting on the sidelines see them scatter, and they write them down, and it says the slaughter was terrible. They chased them all the way back to Gath, all the way back to their home city, and they're killing them. It is exactly what David said would happen. The one other thing I want to mention is in this argument, this taunt between Goliath and David, David describes what's going to happen, and then he says another thing that's a clue to why David is a man after God's own heart. And it's one of my favorite lines in the Bible, really, because he says, this day your army, the birds are going to feast, God will deliver them to us. And he says, and all the world will see, all the world will know that there is a God in Israel. That's what David wants. That's what David is fighting for, that everyone will see that there is, because the only way that you're going to get delivered into our hands is because God's going to be with us. And all the world will see that there's a God in Israel. So this horrendous slaughter that goes on, if you remember, if those of you who are in a study that we did weeks ago, when Israel gets led out of Egypt and the plagues come and God delivers them over and over, later on when they're about to go take Jericho, they find out the people of Jericho are frightened. They're shaking because they hear that Israel is coming. And they've heard the stories about God delivering Israel, about God defeating the Egyptians on their behalf. Word has gone ahead of them, and these people are frightened. David has said, then everyone will know that there's a God in Israel. And there's no doubt at this point that they chased the Philistines back to their walled city, and so few of them make it back. Those people will have no doubt from that day forward that God's delivered this battle for them. So David accomplishes what he said he wanted out of it, what he believes God wants. There's one of your clues to the difference between David and Saul, and why David is a man after God's own heart.
So the end of chapter 17, 18, and 19, we can look at that as sort of the next event, and that is David's relationship with three different people. It really talks.
Well, can we finish up 17?
Well, that's the beginning.
After this is over, actually, when it started, when the David is about to go out and fight, there's a scripture in the couple of chapters before that says Saul is always on the lookout. Anytime he sees a man who is strong or brave, he enlists them into his army. So after David says, I'm going to go out and fight him, when he's going down to meet Goliath, Saul turns to his next in line, his general, and he says, whose son is this? And his general Abner, who is a bad guy in his own right, but Abner says, as surely as you live, O king, I don't know who he is. I've never heard of this kid before. After David kills Goliath, he comes back with the head, but they bring him in front of Saul, and Saul asks him, whose son are you, young man? And David responds, I'm the son of your servant Jesse from Bethlehem. Knowing whose line he was from, I talked last week about how important the family is, the lineage. There are houses, there are families that are prestigious, that are well known, that are powerful, they're rich, and it's a calling card. And David's probably a little bit disappointed to find out this house of Jesse is not a prestigious family. In recent generations, there's a book in the Bible, Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. They're people that the Israelites won't even associate with. And Jesse, David's father, is her grandson. But if you go back a couple of generations before that, back when Israel, the Jews were about to go into Jericho, there was a prostitute named Rahab. And Rahab hides those Israelite spies and sneaks them out of the walled city down a rope. Rahab is the great-great-grandmother of Jesse. This house that David is from, just a few generations before, is Rahab the prostitute, and a couple of generations after that is Ruth, the Moabite woman, the outsider. This is a family that's not prestigious. and they're not especially wealthy. You know, there's a point where David's brother says, why aren't you back home watching those few, you know, skinny cattle that we have? So Saul wants to know, whose house are you from? What's your lineage? And David tells him, I'm the son of your servant Jesse from Bethlehem. Pretty disappointing. Saul has promised that he's going to make this guy, you know, his son-in-law. And you notice that it doesn't happen as we go forward. Saul has made this vow, this promise. Anybody who beats Goliath, I'm going to exempt his family from taxes, and he's going to marry my daughter. And you notice that it doesn't happen. He doesn't immediately go back and say, hooray for David, he's now my son-in-law. He's from the wrong side of the tracks. And it's not an accident that that's in there. So we move on to 18 then?
Yeah, so,
Real quick.
Yeah.
Is it an accident that 25, 26, and 27 are in that particular order? Why is the monetary compensation put in for David, who appears to be at a different level? I really don't care about money. I care about protecting God.
So 25, 26, and 27. David has showed up in this camp, and he's as far as they're concerned, he's running his mouth. He's saying, as far as the other people are concerned, there's this boy, and you got to remember, these are grown men. This is an army, and they're afraid to go out and meet Goliath. And so when this boy comes up and says, how come nobody is going out to meet him? Most of them are going to be ashamed. Yeah, that's pretty natural. And he says, what is the king said, you know, about anybody? And they're just talking. This is just a conversation, Gene. The men who are there hear David, and they say, the king has promised all of these things for anyone who will ride down and meet him. And David then begins to say, somebody's got to do it. So I don't think it's David necessarily saying what's in it for me. It's just a conversation that happens, and we're led to understand that Saul has been promising anybody who will go out and beat this guy great riches, and you'll be my son-in-law. That's why it's there. It's just a conversation.
It's a pretty heavy conversation for a youth to be talking about.
And
how am I going to be rewarded?
it's a pretty heavy conversation for a youth, and his brothers jump all over him for it. His brothers are telling him, you're a kid. It's not that simple. Go back home. You're only here hoping to see a battle, right?
But in number 26, he shoots in that line about uncircumcised Philistines. Why the uncircumcised when Philistines is enough of an enemy? Why did you put in that uncircumcised?
I think we're focusing on the wrong thing with that, and we probably could turn the mic back on, number 3. But I think we're focusing on the wrong thing. What David is saying is, who is this guy? And you know, in a sense, he's saying, who is this lowlife to be insulting the army of the living God? It's the end of that sentence that's important. He's insulting the army of the living God. Who is he to do this? And the implication is, who are we to allow him to do it? That's the interplay. That's what's going on. And it says there's a person in the army that just tells him that the king has said, I'll do all these things. It's not David demanding a reward. Saul has been telling people, Saul's afraid to go out and fight him. And Saul has been telling the whole army, if any of you will go out and beat him, I'll make you rich, and I'll exempt your family from taxes forever. That's what's important. So in 18...
So at the end of 17, the assumption is that Saul's son Jonathan is part of that conversation. And so at the beginning of 18, when it says, after David had finished speaking with Saul, the souls of Jonathan and David were knit together, and Jonathan loved him as himself. And from that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. like I was saying, chapter 18 and 19 basically end up going back and forth talking about three relationships. David's relationship with Jonathan, David's relationship with Saul, and then David's relationship with, what's her name?
Michal.
Michal, which ends up being his wife. So Jonathan, we talked about Jonathan, we mentioned him in an earlier study, but Jonathan was probably 10 years, a decade older than David. He was not enamored by the way his father was doing things. And he seems to be a very honorable man.
Jonathan seems to be a good guy. There is, in the preceding chapters, there are places where Saul does things that Jonathan doesn't approve of. He rides out. In fact, there's one point where Saul is out in the battlefield and Jonathan goes on his own, him and a shield bearer, and they sort of set the Philistines to flight. They climb a bluff. So Jonathan is no fan at times. He has to sort of talk Saul down off the ledge. And he understands, I think Jonathan understands who and what David is. So Jonathan and David become best friends.
And it says in verse 3 that Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. And the thought here, this covenant, think about Jonathan. Saul was the first king of the Israelites, and they didn't necessarily have it all worked out, but I am sure that most people thought Jonathan would be the second king of the Israelites.
Jonathan is supposed to be the next king. It's going to be a hereditary kingship. That was the plan. And what we see here, and this verse confuses a lot of people, with Jonathan giving David his tunic and his robe and all that. What Jonathan is doing is what Saul should have done. Jonathan is the crown prince. He's the next in line. But when David goes out and delivers this Philistine army and delivers this victory for God, Saul has made all these promises, and that's part of the nature of Saul. Saul makes oaths and then doesn't keep them. There's an episode just a couple of chapters before where there's an army on the run, and Saul tells his people, go after them and don't even stop to eat. Go run them down right now, and if any of you stop to eat, you'll be put to death. And he makes an oath. He says, I don't care if it's my own son, he'll be put to death. So what Saul wants is for them to immediately, without stopping, go run down this army. Jonathan hasn't heard that pronouncement. And while they're chasing, there's some honey, there's a honeycomb on the ground, and Jonathan eats some of it. And now he's under penalty of death. And his own father says, well, I gave my word that you'd be killed, and I'm going to have to kill you. You're going to have to be killed. And all the people, all of the soldiers say, how are you going to do this? He hasn't done anything wrong, and he's the one who delivered this battle. And so then Saul goes back on his word. Saul is, do you have that sheet? Yeah. This is a good time for it. I know this seems a little scattered. We'll bring it all together. But yeah, that one will do. Hopefully you can see this. James 1:8 says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. There are some other references, Old Testament references to double-minded people. Saul is a double-minded man, and he is very clearly unstable in all his ways. Let's go ahead and kick it back.
Okay. And we'll see that some of this we'll see this as we go on. It's important to set the stage.
It's a long way. Yeah, we're having to set the stage. It's a long way to go. But what I want you to see out of this is that Saul is just unstable. Saul is undependable. Saul makes promises and doesn't keep them. Saul makes oaths and goes back on them.
Jonathan doesn't.
Jonathan doesn't. And so you see this episode of Jonathan giving up his tunic and his robe and his armor to David. He's doing what the king should have done and didn't. And it says that their souls are knit together. That's a word, nephesh, that has to do with their lives. I could go into a long description, but nephesh is not the same thing as what we normally think of as spirit, but they become very close friends. They're best friends, and there's every indication that Jonathan recognizes who David is as a person. Saul doesn't. Saul's so wrapped up in himself that he doesn't. So this is Jonathan doing what Saul should have. And it's going to become a factor later that these two are such close friends.
Just a second, I have somebody in the waiting room that I have to admit. Okay, sorry about that, Julie. We have a new thing about admitting people. So that gives you an idea, and we'll hear a lot about Jonathan and David going forward. The second, it then goes back to Saul again. It says that that after David came back with the head, they go into into the city, and the women are shouting. And we've heard this before, that they say, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And that's sort of the beginning of the end of Saul just falling apart. Saul was furious and resented this song. They've ascribed tens of thousands to David, but only thousands to me. What more can he have but the kingdom? And from that day forward, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. So we find out about Saul's relationship to David. First of all, he's jealous.
And this again becomes the root of problems that come up. Saul, though, we want to make this distinction between who's who, between Saul and David. And they come riding back into the city victorious. But everybody knows what David has done, and the young women come out, and they're making this song that says that, Saul has slain thousands, but David has slain tens of thousands, and Saul is jealous. And Saul begins to think, this guy could challenge my kingship. He recognizes the potential for a rival. So now it's time to go back and tell another story about Saul. And I know it's back and forth, but you have to see these things in context. So when Saul got anointed, Samuel anoints him. He doesn't immediately become king to all the people. He anoints him and sends him back home. And then, Samuel calls together all the people of Israel. All the tribes are represented. And he says, look, you guys have done evil demanding a king. You shouldn't have done it, but God's going to give you a king. And so Samuel sort of stages this. They narrow down that this king is going to come from the house of Benjamin. And everybody's, okay, this is sort of like, first runner-up in a pageant. He narrows it and narrows it. It's going to come from the house of Benjamin. And then it's going to come from the tribe of, and I forget the tribe name, but it's going to come from this tribe. And then finally, after narrowing it down, he says, and the new king is, here's the big reveal, the new king is Saul. And this is this big introduction, this big reveal, except Saul's not there. Where is Saul? Samuel has just announced this is the guy. And it says that God tells him he has hidden himself among the baggage. This is a grown man. He's already been anointed, and he's just been announced as the new king, and everyone cheers. And then they notice, well, where is he? He's hidden himself among the baggage. Saul is backwards. When he finally comes out, they go and get him. It says he's a head taller than everyone, and there is no one who is his equal in all of Israel. But last week, there's a point where we read that Samuel is dressing Saul down, and he says, do you remember when you were small in your own eyes? God saw you, who you were, and he put you over the tribes, and he anointed you as king. And what that was about is Samuel telling him, grow up. You know, you're the king. There was a time where you were small in your own eyes and you went and hid among the baggage, but you're the king now. You don't have any reason to feel like you're small, like you're not up. I mean, you're not growing into this king job. And so what we see when they ride back in, Saul is the king. Saul is anointed. Everyone has acclaimed him. Everyone has said, you know, long live the king. But Saul is threatened by this 17-year-old boy.
So he's jealous of him. Going on to line 12, it says, so Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So Saul definitely has self-esteem issues. He's afraid, he's jealous, and that's going to play out time and time again in the entire book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd. And remember, Saul had promised whoever won this was going to get his oldest daughter. It says in verse 17, then Saul said to David, here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage, only to be valiant for me and fight for the Lord's battle. But Saul was thinking, I need to raise my hand against him. I do not need to raise my hand against him. Let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And David said to Saul, who am I, and what is my family or my father's clan in Israel, that I should become the son-in-law of the king? So when it became time to give Saul's daughter Merab to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. So he didn't keep his promise. He didn't get the oldest daughter.
We need to talk about some things here. These are things that get lost. Saul has promised that whoever beats the Philistine would be married to his daughter. But you notice in between, David has been leading the army. He's been going out, and it says he takes them out and brings them back home. He's successful. An army will not mind following a young man, a boy, probably 18 by now. If he takes you out and leads you back, gets you back home alive, they love him. And it says they love him. So time passes. What should have happened after Saul's promise is he should have brought him back and immediately married him to his daughter. That's what he said he would do. But he doesn't do it. Instead, David goes out leading these sorties, these battles, and he's very, very successful. And Saul is threatened by it. He sees his popularity, and so he says, you know what, I have this daughter. I'm gonna offer that he should become my son-in-law, and I'm gonna tell him, all you gotta do is just work for me forever. You just go out and lead a bunch of battles. This is a never-ending task. And he'd already earned that right. David had already earned it by defeating Goliath. And instead he says, all you got to do is just keep riding out for me forever and ever. Don't think that David doesn't understand. When it says that from that moment on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David, David's no fool. David's a sharp kid. He understands. And he sees this as the trap that it is. And he says, hey, you know, my family, who am I? I come from this minor, not prestigious family. Who am I to be the king's son-in-law? I can't do it. The rest of the story is he's supposed to marry a king's daughter, a dowry. He's supposed to make a big payment. Kings marry their daughters not just in that time. They marry their daughters to prestigious, rich people, powerful people. And David knows he's not. He sees the trap. This would keep him under Saul's thumb, and so he declines.
Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and when this was reported to Saul, it pleased him. We tell this part of the story. So Saul decides, hey, I got another shot at this, and he sends his servants out to David and says to tell them, behold, the king is pleased with you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become a son-in-law. But when David's servants relayed this word to David, he replied, does it seem trifle in your sight to be the son-in-law of the king? I'm a poor man and lightly esteemed. So the servants went back, told Saul this. Saul says, hey, go back and tell him again. Say to David, the king desires no other dowry, so you don't have to pay anything, but all you have to do is 100 Philistine foreskins as revenge on his enemies.
So he marries the oldest daughter off, and he's got a younger one. And it says he wants this younger daughter to be a snare for David. And his idea is to send David out in the field and get him killed. Michal, the daughter, is in love with David, and Saul hears about it. And this is perfect. He's going to use her as a snare. And so he sends word, instead of doing it himself, he sends the servants. David is still sharp enough to go, I don't have a dowry. I'm not from a powerful family. And Saul sends word back and says, no. All I want you to do is go out and kill 100 Philistines and bring back the trophies, right? Bring back proof. This is a different situation for David because this is finite. This is, he has set a number, and David knows now all I have to do, and I will have earned the right to be the king's son-in-law. I will have earned the right. This is not, you work for Saul forever.
And it says here, when the servants reported these terms to David, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. Before the wedding day arrived, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented them as payment in full to become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave his daughter Michal to David in marriage.
One line we skipped over, probably should have mentioned. David keeps coming back in from these battles successful, and Saul by this point has become moody and unstable. And David is playing the harp, and Saul has a spear, a javelin, and he throws a spear at David. And David evades it. It says this happens twice. Saul has gotten to the point that he resents David so much that and I'm sure he said, oh, it was a training accident. I was throwing a spear, it got away from me. So David knows that Saul's not fond of him. But he does this, he realizes, now I can earn the right to be the king's son-in-law. He goes and kills not 100, but 200. And you see the problem for Saul is because he comes back in. Once again, David comes in more successful than anyone would have dreamed. And he kind of shows Saul up a little bit. He upstages this. He says, you want me to have killed 100? We killed 200, and here's proof. Here are the trophies. And he becomes Saul's son-in-law. And now, now Saul has really got a problem on his hands.
So you've got Saul jealous and afraid. You've got Jonathan, his best friend, and you've got Michal, who is the king's daughter, and she's in love with David, but she's going to be tested. Is she more in love with David, or is she more the king's little girl? So we go on to chapter 19, and it says, then Saul ordered his son Jonathan and all his servants to kill David. And Jonathan's like, wait a minute, my father Saul he tells David this, that he intends to kill him. And he says, my father Saul intends to kill you. Be on your guard in the morning. Find a secret place and hide there. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, so I can ask you. And if I find out anything, I will tell you.
So, you see this fall of King Saul, he actually says now he is so jealous, he's so threatened that he tells Jonathan and his servants and other people, I want you to kill David. Just flat out, I want him killed.
And Jonathan tells his dad, why would you do this? He's not done anything but, helped us with the Philistines to defeat them. And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan and swore an oath. Here's another oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. He says, okay, you're right. He won't be put to death. So Jonathan.
It's a picture. You should get this picture of Saul, because Saul has in one of his moods said, I want you to kill David. And Jonathan warns David, and he goes and talks to his dad, and he goes, look, this guy hasn't done anything wrong, and he keeps making us successful. He's good for the kingdom. He's good for you. He's good for us. What are you doing? And here's Saul. All of a sudden, he's on the other end. Oh, you're right. And he makes this oath, as surely as I live, David is not going to be killed. He's just all over the place. And it's a problem for a kingdom to be led by someone like that.
So actually, then when war broke out again, David went out and fought the Philistines and struck them with such a mighty blow that they fled before him. But as Saul was sitting in his house, this is when the spirit thing happened, with his spear in his hand, a spirit of distress from the Lord came upon him. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him on the wall with his spear, but the spear struck the wall, and David eluded him, ran away, and escaped that night. Oh, that was the third time that
This
happened.
is the third time. It happens that, and if you wonder how that plays out, you practice with your weapons. And I'm sure he's throwing his spear, he's getting his practice. And if he happens to put one into David and kill him, he just says, like I told you before, I was practicing with the spear and it got away from me. It's a shame. Here's Saul willing to kill his best general because he's jealous. And because David has come back in wildly successful. And this up and down just keeps going. We're cutting this a little short, but that's what happens. It's just constant up and down. I have seen this play out. If this seems odd to you, I have seen this play out in the corporate world. Probably some of the rest of you have. But it doesn't pay to show up the CEO. It doesn't pay to, Fran's laughing over here. Fran, I happen to know that you've witnessed a few of these too. It doesn't pay to show up the CEO. And I've seen this kind of jealousy. I have seen good people put out of a company simply for being too successful, for being a threat to the main guy. This is not make-believe. This is not a story. I've seen it happen.
So we're going to stop here and take up with McCall next week. And McCall has the decision of whether to be loyal to her husband or to her father.
Saul is now prepared. And remember, just a few verses ago, Saul has made an oath. As surely as I live, David won't be killed. And here we are again. Saul's throwing a spear at him. And now Saul is going to send people specifically to kill David. Can we bring up real quick? We have just one more minute. Bring up that other scripture. Was that Stan?
Yeah, okay,
I'll make this quick.
Okay, which one?
Understanding Saul 1. Over here.
This one right here?
Yeah.
Okay. Share.
Come down to it.
Okay.
I read the other one about, okay, no, that's good. Here it is. We've talked about the thing about David being a man after God's own heart. And the other problem with Saul is that people still have idols in their homes. Saul is supposed to be God's king. And so on the front end, we have Saul, and on the back end, we have his son Solomon. I just want to read this to you for next week. Solomon was David's son, and it says when Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and he was not wholeheartedly devoted to Yahweh as his father David had been. His father David had been wholeheartedly devoted to Yahweh. And as we go through these weeks, I know that skips forward to the end. David is going to make some mistakes, but as David rides out to these battles, what we see is he's fighting for Yahweh. He is fighting God's battles, and God is with him. And God is not with Saul at this point. Saul has been told that God has removed his spirit from him. And so Saul and Saul's generals, it tells us, are not being successful. And David comes back every time. That's going to set the stage for what happens next week.
Right?
God, we have examples of both the best and the worst of who we should be and sometimes who we are. We ask for reminders through these of, we see examples of mistakes that we make. Let us see ourselves in these examples, the times when we do these exact things. You left this word for us, and sometimes it's easier to see when it's other people. It's easier to see when it's someone from an old history. But we should see ourselves, and I ask that you would remind us, that you would reveal to us the times when we do these same things. Be with us this week. Be with those we've prayed for. We have so many that are suffering. We have so many to keep up with. We ask for your hand on these that we've spoken to. I don't know how to pray for the whole world. I have to trust that your hand is there, but we see these people that we know and we suffer with them. And we ask for your hand on them this week. We ask for them to see and to feel your presence. Amen.
Okay, you guys can unmute yourselves, and let me see if I can figure out how to stop.
How old do we think Saul was when he's
Saul
practicing